I was afraid to come out here. And I was going to start out by just bringing you a little bit of bad news. I was going to say, well, you know, with all that praise and all that adoration and stuff coming from Tom and from Elizabeth and, ooh, I was going to, Kerry James Marshall had a heart attack back there. He won't be coming out tonight, so I'll be sitting in.
So don't worry about
I'll be sitting in his stead.
That's right. Well, that's okay. Just in case that happened, I was just.
Bill, you can go on without me.
No way, brother.
Oh, wow. Well, thank you all for coming. You know, with expectations set so high, it's hard to know where to begin. I mean, it really is hard to know where to begin. But you know what I want to do is I want to kind of lay a kind of foundation for the conversation. And so I did jot down some notes and a brief kind of introduction that would launch us into the conversation. I mean, and this will truly be a conservation, not a conservation, but a conversation. But I wanted to put, I want this underneath the conversation as some ground that we can trod upon, because I think it says something about, in a way, about what this all means, you know, and how I perceive what this all means for me. And so I'm going back to 1965, between 1965 and 1968, because we had the pleasure last night of having dinner with Dodi Kazanjian and Calvin Tompkins. And of course, he gave me a copy of his book, The Bride and the Bachelors, you know, which when I was in school at Otis really was one of those foundation books, you know, that kind of helped define what it really meant to be a part of the contemporary art world. You know, and if you, for the people who don't know the book, I mean, it was essentially a series of interviews he had done with Marcel Duchamp, with John Cage, with Merce Cunningham, with Robert Rauschenberg, and with Jean Tingley. And there was something, I was reading through it last night, and I came across the patches that I thought would really be appropriate for the way we would start out tonight. And so I'm going to start with that, and then I'm going to go into my own little introduction, and then we can get underway. But here's, so from the introduction to The Bride and the Bachelors, speaking about Duchamp and Rauschenberg, so Calvin Tompkins, talking about the New York of the late 50s and 60s, wrote, "There's some evidence that the climate of New York may now have become almost too favorable for heresies and radical experiments. The appearance of a large and militantly avant-garde audience, a shock-proof public that accepts whatever is offered in the name of art so long as it is certifiably new and in, has impressed Duchamp, among others, that the long decline of Western art has finally reached its nadir. It is all too easy for young artists to succumb to the asphyxiating embrace of this art-fashioned audience. That since his triumph at the 1964 Venice Biennale, Robert Rauschenberg's response to this sudden and spectacular elevation to the status of a modern master from an enfant terrible has been more or less to withdraw from painting into a period of doing simply experimentation. And on some level, I mean, as I was listening to the introduction out there, I understand perfectly well what Robert Rauschenberg must have felt. Because there's something a little bit unsettling about wild praise. I mean, especially for people who are in the arts, and in particular now in painting, you know, where we are used to a certain kind of obscurity as a matter of expectation. And I have to say, for me as an African-American artist, even with the ambitions that I had to end up in a place like the Metropolitan, I mean, we all know there's no guarantee that you will achieve the things you set out to achieve. And so to finally have arrived, in a way, here, and to have had the work received as well as it has been received is a bit daunting. Because what the praise does not alleviate is the doubt.
Right.
We are riddled with doubt. And sometimes that doubt can only be allayed by a certain kind of critical acknowledgement. And I'm pretty sure that was the same kind of critical acknowledgement that Robert Rauschenberg was looking for, and the reason why he continued. So once you become so successful or become so well known and recognized for a particular thing, you almost immediately want to stop doing that and go on to something else, because you need to find out you need to find out where the truth was in the assessment of whatever it was you were doing. And so here I am, sitting here on this stage, after having enjoyed, the trifecta of the New York Times in terms of acknowledgement, with a feature article about the show in advance of its opening, with a cover image on the New York Times T magazine and an interview inside. And then I think, in a way, a spectacular review by Holland Cotter once the show was ready to open. So that's the trifecta. I mean, you kind of can't win. You can't do more than that in New York. And so I had, but as a part of that whole process, I did 16 hours of interviews with New York Times writers. 16 hours. And then they wanted more, so I ended up having to do a video interview with Theaster Gates, who is a friend of mine in Chicago. And the first question Theaster asked me was what I wanted to talk about, and I said, I don't want to talk about nothing. I'm done. But I was already committed to doing this presentation here at the Met, so now I must carry on. But in thinking about how to do it, I mean, it's really hard to figure out what to talk about in a venue like this, in an environment like this. And so I thought, well, I mean, nothing could be further from my specialty than sports. Which is not to say I don't watch a lot of sports. I do. And I'm interested in the dynamics of the enterprise and the games and the players. But I couldn't think of anybody else I would have wanted to engage in a conversation about sports and art with than Bill Rhoden. And in part because of the book he wrote, $40 Million Slaves, which dovetails, I think, with a lot of the dynamics that are implicated in my arrival here at the Metropolitan. Because that book was not really about whether or not athletes were good athletes or whether or not they were paid well or anything like that, but it was whether or not the pay they got for the performance they gave amounted to real power. And so that's some of what I think we will end up talking about in the conversation we have, among other things. But this is how this all came about.
So where can I start? So I'm in Atlanta. I just got finished giving a talk at the Georgia State about, typical thing, racism, empowerment, kind of stuff like that. So I get this letter from Jennifer, and it starts off with, Kerry, James Marshall. I said, wow, really? So I was like reading this and said, well, where is this going? I said, maybe I'm going to finally get this discount. by the way. So that's what this all is about. But anyway, no. So as I'm reading it, and again, I recently had and by the way, where's Sandra? Off that you should have taped that because that was so X-rated, that I've been trying to think about. So what can we actually take from that conversation that won't get everybody fired from here, But so as I was reading it, and then finally you said that you wanted to have a conversation and bridge this gap about 40 million slaves. And I said, wow, this is very interesting because you were the first person that got this book, 40 million slaves. And again, I've been writing about I've been a jazz critic, a sports writer for almost 40 years. But what you got is that this really wasn't, this could have been written about any place where black people are. Black people at the New York Times, black people working here at the Met, black people on Wall Street, black people in big real estate firms. It's about being excluded, when you get power, being afraid to use it, who defines you? And that's been our dilemma for the last 400 years, is always being defined. And so nothing could prepare you. I'm familiar with your work, and by the way, this is such an honor. I must tell you, I'm totally honored to share this stage with you, to be here with you, to share in this kind of space, and putting ourselves in a position to tell some truth. Now, one thing you did not tell me, you said, I could come to the barbershop, I come to your barbershop, but you didn't tell me all these people are going to be at your barbershop, which means that, I know my barbershop is up in Harlem, and I mean, we can't curse, and
We won't be doing any cursing.
We won't be doing
here
any
either.
cursing, and normally don't bring notes to the barbershop, but we both did. But one of the challenges was, and we've had a lot of very blunt conversations about my world and your world, which on the face of it was really different. I mean, we've had some not knockdown, drag-outs, but some debates about our two worlds and how they coalesce. And on the surface, I'm very fluent in the music, in jazz, because I work with a lot, and I could have easily written 40 Million Slaves about the music. Have all these great black innovators, but not owning anything, not basically having the music, but that's it. You don't own the means of production. You don't own, the clubs that you play in. But to get into the art world, I said, wow, that's a whole dimension that I hadn't really thought about. And nothing could prepare me when Jennifer and I, we saw this exhibit twice, just solo, and nothing could prepare me for just the power of this exhibit, frame after frame, floor after floor. And what I realized is what we had in common, and I love art, I'm clearly not an art critic, but I love art, but what we had in common was this love of black people and this burning desire and almost a need that we define ourselves. And that was that's the common ground about this need to define ourselves, to insert ourselves in a place like this where we did not exist. And I work in a world of primarily football, basketball, but what I call the blood sports, consisting of a lot of young African-American men and women, but primarily men when you talk about the blood sport of football, the blood sport of basketball. And even there, this idea of who defines you is something that's very, very elusive. Here you deal with critics. In our realm, if you would ever walk to a press box during and I invite anybody to do it, you walk through a press box that holds about 200 people. And on any given day, I'm like the only person there, the only black person there. I'm not talking about a person of color. I'm not talking about diversity. I'm talking about a black person. And it kind of gets back to who defines us. I mean, who says who we are, what we represent. So the idea of us kind of engaging in this conversation represents a very unique challenge, but it gets to the same point about who defines us. You know, who
Yeah,
we are.
yeah. Well, but the other thing, I mean, the other place I think where there's overlap between what happens in the art world and what happens in the sports world is that I'm obsessed with winning.
Yes.
And in football and basketball and baseball, those operations are also obsessed with winning. Now, I live in Chicago, and we just got a taste of winning when the Cubs won the World Series after 108 years. 108 years since they last went to the World Series. And so now there's something that has to be examined about a fan base that supports a team like the Cubs that were perennial losers, and yet their fan base never diminished. They stayed with them all the time. They worked with, at least they browbeat the owners, you know, tried to make them make better decisions about who they recruited, who they traded for, who they held on to, because there's no valor in losing. And
unless you're a Knicks fan. I mean, if you like the Knicks, then there is valor.
But it's not like the Knicks have always lost.
Well, it's been a long time.
Well, but the thing.
Go ahead.
Well, but the thing is, but if you think about this whole idea of winning and losing, and its relationship to the arts, well, I don't see that there's a whole lot of difference between the way we define winning and losing in the arts and the way winning and losing is achieved in a sports franchise. Well, so if you take everything we do as human beings, I think, is hierarchical in its structural organization. There are people at the top, and then there are people in the middle, and then there are people at the bottom. The vast number of people who we know are almost all located somewhere down near the bottom. And in the art world, there's been this assumption that if you are not somehow already positioned at the top, then there's no way, no mechanism for you to put into play that will allow you to get there. That the decisions about who arrives at a place like the Metropolitan have not only already been determined, but they're being determined by some secret cabal of people who have the kind of knowledge and the critical acumen and the good eye that people who know what good art is supposed to look like, those are the people who already know that. And if you don't know that, then there's no way for you to get in. And so when I started out being interested in art and going to the LA County Art Museum, coming to the Metropolitan Museum, going to the Museum of Modern Art, going to the Whitney, and all those places where I thought I would never be, my goal was always to figure out, is there a way to win? I mean, can you win? Can you play this game called art in such a way that it gave you a better chance of winning than not? Because if you didn't win, then the consequences of not being a part of this, well, for me, it's intolerable. So how can you, and besides that, the whole notion that you somehow have to surrender your potential to be a part of these things to some group of anonymous people, or even people that you think you may know about, and that you don't have anything to say about it, this is also intolerable. And so when I started thinking about, the way we understand art history, I mean, I can lay it out in the same way that you would lay out the prospects for the first round of draft picks coming out of college in the football draft. You know, there's always going to be the guy who got the Heisman Trophy. You know, everybody wants him. There's always going to be those people whose production on the field seemed high enough so that everybody thought they would go really early in the draft. But then once those people are picked, if you look at the structure of any professional sports team, They are the starters. They're those people who are the highest paid, who get the most money in their salaries. They are the people who are bench players, who come off the bench and are utility players, that they have a particular job that they can perform, especially if a job when either one of the players gets hurt or somebody gets in foul trouble if you're playing basketball. And then there's a whole group of players who are on these teams who are only there as pawns to be shifted around to help to work out the way they can negotiate their salary caps. Some of those people will be on a team for 3, 4, 5, maybe 10 years and never get to touch the ball, never get to get out on the court. Now, is it satisfactory for anybody to be in that position? I mean, just to say I got a Knicks jersey on,
Well,
say I got a Chicago Bulls jersey on, I mean, is it enough?
Yeah. Because like
And so, but I'm looking at the art world like that too. I mean, is it really enough for us to have gone to school and gotten a degree and gotten in a few group shows somewhere, or be showing at some not-for-profit place and never get a chance, never get invited to the Whitney Biennial, even though, just like some of the top draft picks, people who get invited to the Whitney Biennial, you may never hear from them again either. So in my perception, there has to be some way of thinking about what's happening to all those people that you can avoid. I mean, there has to be something you can know. Because if there isn't, then you are at the mercy of what? I mean, yes, there's a certain amount of luck involved, a certain amount of luck. But I don't think people who are writing the critical examination of artists, who are writing the exhibition catalogs, who are writing for art history, I don't think they're throwing things up in the air and sort of seeing how they fall. This is not a matter of chance, because there's just way too much agreement on which kinds of things constitute the works that belong in a place like this for that to be accidental. And if it's not accidental, then there must be something you can know, and then there must also be something you might be able to do in order to make sure that your chances of being in this place are better than 50-50.
So, Kerry, let me say this. No. I think, first of all, one of the first of the many debates that we had that we kind of pushed back, we had some things, I mean, I won't dabble too much in that, but when you start going into sport, remember, one of the things I thought was the huge difference between, you mentioned winning. Now, I come from a world, and particularly I want to re-emphasize, I'm talking about the blood sports, of football, the NFL, football, major college, basketball, the NBA, basketball, major college, where young black men dominate. In other words, industry runs on them. They don't necessarily like black people, but they need them. They need them. It's how this developed, they just need it. And so in the art world, and I guess one of the things I always like about that is that it's finite. Winning, in my view, is finite. There's not a lot left to, in the blood sports, not a lot left to the imagination, which is why we dominate so much. It's not a lot, well, I kind of like this, I kind of like that. No, you either, you jump high, you run fast, you train, you're strong. And so what I was proposing to you, remember when the first conversation we had, well, whose path to, let's say, if you could consider the Met, the Super Bowl, or Wimbledon, whose path is the clearest? The young, I think we talked about the 15-year-old. The young 15-year-old black kid, growing up in Chicago, or who wants to either get to the league or get to the NFL, or the young 15-year-old who really has these art skills and one day would love to be here in a gallery. What's the route? And I'm thinking, I always thought, that the route for the young black is much clearer. It's much clearer. Now, I'm not
for the
talking
athlete, you mean?
For the athlete, yeah, for the athlete. But specifically in the blood sports of football, basketball, tennis, gymnastics, things like that, the more you deal with judgment, the worse off black people tend to be. When it deals with finite, that you just can't, like that's why you go to an Alabama football game or a Clemson football game or Oklahoma football, and the team is almost like 97% black. It's not like they like black people, that's sad. It's that however this is America, we need them. We need them. We need this. This is how the industry is. It's a billion-dollar industry, and we need these. The same people, the same young people who might be getting murdered, had they not have the uniforms on, have adult men begging them to come to their schools. Now, in art, they don't necessarily need black kids to be artists. We got plenty of white artists. We don't need, we've got that covered. So my is that is, I mean,
I don't.
really, that's not what we need. We got plenty of the ballet people. We got the, what we don't have, and how the hell this happened, I don't know. We need people to play for the University of Alabama. We need people to play for Clemson. That's what we need you guys to do, what you've been doing for 400 years. Mm-hmm. Tote the barge, lift the bale, and guess what? We still have the power. Mm-hmm. I just thought that in your field, the route for a young black person to get to this point is so much more difficult and hazy because A, they don't necessarily need you to do this, and B, there's no clear-cut standard. I mean, what's being what is winning? Mm-hmm. And I'm sure maybe you've been through that. People look at the work and well, I don't know, I don't know. You don't seem to have, so I see what you're saying about the teams and all that, but I just think that it's much more difficult, and particularly in the fine arts. Mm-hmm. You could argue maybe in music and jazz particularly, maybe it may be a little easier, but even now it's becoming more difficult for young black people because they've finally managed over the past 30 years to move the music into the conservatory. Mm-hmm. And anytime you put a price tag on things, mm-hmm. the mass of black people are out. Mm-hmm. That's just the reality. When you slap a price tag on things, we tend to be out because it's money. So.
Because that. Well, I mean.
What do you think about that?
I'm going with you part of the way. I'm going to go with you part of the way because it's true. The economics of the art world have never favored the participation of black folks because black folks have never had the kind of disposable capital to invest in these things like art because in the first place, nobody really needs this art that we're making, any of it, by anybody.
Don't forget about that discount. Man.
It performs. Well, but so now because the art world has evolved to a place where it's completely disconnected from any use value that it has for the culture that it's embedded in. We know the history of its relationship. And this is across cultures in general. Where you have the production of not only objects and images, but literature and performance that was done in the service of some other useful need that the community of people had. So it was either it performed some spiritual function, it performed some magical function, it performed some judicial kind of function. People made artworks and made objects because they did things that helped to keep the community of people knitted together. In Europe, the church was the primary patron of arts once the churches became institutions like they did. Then from there, other institutions of power, principalities, all the people who were commissioning artists to make work that told their story. Well, you can even go back to the pyramids. That's not everybody on the pyramids. Like when you see a lot of pictures of Ramses, it's because Ramses is the man of power. And the story that's being told is his story. Yeah. And everybody who's working is working to help amplify Ramses' story. But in the West, the production of artwork was also designed on some level to amplify the power of the Western world. During the Renaissance, where did that money come from that helped pay for a lot of that stuff? The 15th century, Columbus, the age of exploration, the age of conquest, the age of discovery, the age of colonization, the age of imperialism, all of that stuff. That's where the money to pay for a lot of that stuff came from. And when there was no money to pay for it, they stopped making stuff. They went to work for somebody else who had the money. So institutions like the Metropolitan Museum, the Museum of Modern Art, those things don't happen without a lot of money or without a lot of people who had a lot of money and a lot of people who had artwork that they accumulated over time. That's how these museums got to be what they are. And in none of that, I don't know, so you can probably date within my lifetime the first time, if there was any time, that a work that enters the collection of the Metropolitan Museum or the Louvre or any other museum, the Tate in London, that was bought by and given to that museum by a black person who had the kinds of resources to acquire that kind of work. That's just not how. And those museums, they achieved the status and the standing they did without us. They could have gone on for another 150 years or two or even longer without us. That's all true. All that's true. But this notion, but the notion of the path to the Metropolitan or the path to the Super Bowl, that it is yes, it may in fact be a little foggier than the path of some superstar athlete to the championship. But I don't think it's any less, I don't think it's much less clear. Because if you think about athletes, I mean, there are some people who have what they call a natural or innate talent, who are born with a little bit more ability, run a little faster, jump a little higher, just because of things they can't identify. Likewise, there are people who make art who are born with the kind of ability to perceive and translate almost directly from the things they perceive into another language. They can do that easily. But there's nothing that artists do that is incomprehensible, that is not also learnable. Not a single thing. And so, and if you track, I mean, if you are interested in being in a place like the Metropolitan, it's not all that hard to track the evolution of thought that leads to the decisions that bring things that are in the Metropolitan into the museum. That's not hard to figure out, because I think that's pretty clearly outlined as well. And you can do that by taking an overview of the collected historical narratives of art and what people have said was important over the last 300 or 400 or 500 years. You could even start with Vasari's Lives of the Artists, and you can track from there that there hasn't been a whole lot of difference in the way people's understanding of what was valuable in art has been organized. And at any of those moments when something that appeared to be a radical transformation took place, well, you can see why that was assumed to be the case too. Because because they are not doing things, this is where they are not also playing with the sort of misty, magical kinds of forces. I mean, you can actually mine the narrative and find that information. And so there was an interesting thing I had heard. So in talking about this age of conquest and the age of exploration, that one of the reasons why so many companies or people or princes and barons were financing the ships of the conquistadors and places like that was because when the conquistadors, when Columbus came on his voyages to the New World, they took notes. They wrote down stuff. And what they wrote down became a road map for anybody else who wanted to do the same thing they did. And so Cortez reads these notes that other explorers wrote, and he said, well, I can do that too. And so they get on a ship and they come down to Mexico or to South America. And they understand that because they've described the social structure of the places where they went to. I remember reading in Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States where he quotes from Columbus's journal this phrase, and it seems to be the key to the whole thing. Columbus says in his journal, these people we've encountered here have no tempered steel, they have no swords, they have no things like that. 50 people can come down here, we can make them do anything we want them to do. Right. They were following a roadmap. And so in the art world, that history, the criticality, the differences, the arguments, because there were people who were having arguments about every stage of the development of what we call art, all the way up to what we know of as modern and contemporary art. There have been people arguing about this thing. None of that stuff was automatically settled. It was all being argued about. Now, at some point, you can decide whether you can get in the argument or not. And if you want to get in the argument, you got to pay the price of the ticket. And the price of the ticket is knowing. It's knowing what they said. Knowing how somebody else said this was supposed to be. And then saying to yourself, well, I think I got something to say about that. And then I'm going to say it this way. And then once you get in the mix like that, it's not a whole lot different than going out on the basketball court. Now, there are people who are good at shooting three-point shots early on, but I think a lot of people work on the three-point shot to make sure they are better at it. I mean, we talked a little bit about, so you have some players who seem dominant in one area of a sport. Let's take Shaquille O'Neal, for example. Couldn't shoot a free throw to save his life. And sometimes winning or losing a game is determined by whether or not you make those free throws when you get a chance to do it. And so when people saw that Shaquille O'Neal could be dominant inside, but he couldn't make a free throw, they developed a technique. They developed a strategy they call the hack-a-shack. You know, if you get in trouble, put Shaquille O'Neal on the line, because we know he ain't going to make it. I mean, he may make 1 out of 10 of those. Mm-hmm. So that becomes a strategy. And they use it on other players, too, who have the same inability to make free throws that Shaquille O'Neal has. When you look at the art world, you got to treat it the same way. I mean, as long as you allow for the certain kind of mystification of what's going on in the art world to reign, then it will always be cloudy. Right. And then you will have more and more people with a desire to participate, but having no idea how to construct a pathway to getting there. And as I said earlier, since I'm all about winning, I'm also all about sort of figuring out strategically what it takes to get from where you are to what you want. Mm-hmm. I mean, and it really comes down to what do you really want? I mean, do you want to be there? Do you want to be at the top? If you want to be at the top, then you got to figure out how to get there, and it can't be dependent on somebody else's legitimizing.
But oftentimes it is, and particularly in this world, it is, I'd say, more so than in the field of sport and play. It is based on somebody deciding, which is almost at the essence of your whole art, is inserting blackness into your art in a very concrete and very forceful way.
But you have to force the issue. I mean, you really do. You have to force the issue. I mean, it's like, so, I mean, but you know what? It's like we were watching the NBA playoffs last year, you know, the Golden State Warriors, first with the Oklahoma. It's like that disaster for Oklahoma. And then the game with the Cleveland Cavaliers. And it's like, from where I was sitting in my living room watching the games, you could see it as a pattern repeating itself over and over and over again. It's like you got Steph Curry and you got
Durant.
No, before Durant, the other three-point shooter. What's his Klay. Klay Thompson. Mm-hmm. So you got Steph Curry and Klay Thompson. And it's like you could see the movements around the court. And you say, I know, when he passes that ball, I know he's going to end up right there. And it's like they were doing it like clockwork. And the three-point shots at a point were just sort of raining down on their opponents. And they would do the same thing every time. And it's like they couldn't figure out how to stop that. Well, and the only way you can win, really, is to figure out how to stop that.
Right. And the interesting thing, we talked about that this afternoon, and this is such a major difference in the two worlds. And your world of art is completely unregulated, by the way, completely unregulated. But that's another conversation for another day. But what happened is that how Kevin Durant dealt with that devastation, right? He dealt with that devastation by what? Saying, well, you know what? I'm going to another team.
Well, he took the, if you can't beat him, join him.
Exactly, which again, in your world, I mean, well, you did say that an artist can actually play for 3 teams simultaneously. I mean, you could have...
You can.
And have no loyalty at all.
I didn't say no loyalty at all.
Well, you said, well...
But I said you
loyalty can take a back seat.
No, I didn't say that either.
You kind of said that.
No, I didn't.
Where's your wife? Did he kind of say that?
No, I didn't.
Because we were talking about it. So
No, but what I said,
I said, have there been artists? Have there been artists who have, before anybody knew them, they had a house that was associated with them, and then after they got big and exploded, they left, like Kevin Durant left
Right.
Oklahoma. They left and went to another house.
Right.
And I said, is that? And you said it's kind of common.
oh yeah, artists do all the time. Go from one gallery to another. Sometimes determined by how well they think they're being treated at one place or how well they think they're being served in terms of their market at one place or another. I mean, artists move around because they think they're not being supported sometimes by the gallery they're working with. But those same artists are not just moving from one gallery. Some of those same artists.
They want to win.
Well, they want to win.
They want to win.
Well,
right?
they
want to win.
They want to win. They need to win. They have big studio programs to support. You got to make some money to support that stuff.
Kevin Durant's got
and so
a
there are
family.
people who, but at the same time, some of those artists are being represented and shown by 5 or 6 or 7 galleries, and you can see their work showing up. So it's not uncommon for artists to be represented by more than one gallery. I am myself.
There we go.
So, but in terms of this notion, so now this notion of joining the team that beats you because you think that's going to be the best way. So that's following a failure on the part of the way I perceived it. There was no way Oklahoma should have lost that series.
And then they wouldn't have lost.
They shouldn't have lost that series. There was a collapse within the relationship between those players on that team. There had to have been. But instead of resolving whatever that inadequacy was going to be, with that team and sort of putting it in a position, where strategically where they might have a better chance of beating Golden State the next time they came out. Personally, the challenge is greater to solve the problem with the team that you're with than it is to abandon the team and go with the team that beats you.
Well,
I just think it's more interesting to try and do that than it is to do what Kevin Durant did. That's not interesting to me because that's a way of trying to guarantee that you're going to get a championship because you're going with the people that kicked your butt.
Well,
but I'm thinking it's somehow it's more challenging and more interesting to solve the problem of whatever it was that caused your team to break down. I'm just saying that because I think that's interesting.
Yeah, no, well, maybe.
And so in the art world,
everybody wants to get to the Met. Everybody wants to get, and you get there however you can get there. I mean, it's, like I said, it's two different. Different worlds, but everybody wants to get to the Met. I guess that's
but the challenge of getting to the Met, though, then is can you solve the problem of the lack of access to an institution of the stature of the Metropolitan? What's the solution to the problem? So on the one hand, the solution for the problem could be, well, let's build another museum that competes with the Met.
Well, see, now
that's
right.
a solution
Right.
to a problem.
Right.
It's the reason why a lot of museums of contemporary art exist in the first place.
Right.
Because at the Art Institute of Chicago is a powerful, well-respected, well-regarded museum. It has a fantastic collection. There were people who weren't invited to be on the board at the Art Institute of Chicago, so their answer to that was the Museum of Contemporary Art. Mm-hmm. Now the Museum of Contemporary Art is as powerful as the Art Institute of Chicago in the domain that they are operating in. And you got the Art Institute of Chicago playing catch up to some dimensions of what the Museum of Contemporary Art are doing. That's one way of doing it. That's one way for people who for people who just got to have a place of their own. Or if you're Eli Broad, I build myself a big museum and I got more money than they do. I'll build a museum, I'll put all this stuff in it, and I'll open it up free.
That's one thing
and
I wanted to ask you about, too. I mean, kind of switching gears, but in that same vein, because we started the conversation, where's our tape guy, our cut guy? This thing is moving around. But we started the conversation talking about self-determination and self-definition, which is one of my obsessions when it comes to, black folks in the United States, is how to determine, I think we talked about how do you level the playing field? And the way you level the playing field is you buy your own field. And during one
That's
of our
one way.
Yeah, and during one of our conversations, we were talking about, and I just took notes. We were talking about the Studio Museum and black folks and building institutions that maybe once existed, but because of the whole integration thing, we're kind of getting to Jackie Robinson and how that at the end of the day was not really good for our community. It really was not good for our community, that kind of desegregation. And so one of the things you said, and I thought was compelling, you said, if you want the Studio Museum to be as important and as powerful as major museums, if you have $2 million, give it to the Studio Museum. That gives people, no, this is really terrible. I can't. You said that gives them opportunities, the museums, that gives these museums opportunities that they would not have without that money. For black people who have millions of dollars to give away, it's a mistake to give it to one of these other major museums
The Museum of
and not to the Studio Museum. The goal is for the Studio Museum to be on par with MoMA and not having to beg for money. The goal is to be independent. And I thought about the same thing and sort of in this book, the whole idea of Negro Leagues. Back in 1919 when they said, you know what, y'all can't play baseball. Rube Foster said, well, you know what, yes, we'll establish our own league. We got plenty of baseball players, we got plenty of banks. We'll do our own. We'll start our own. Because his long-term goal was to build a team and institution so powerful that they would come in to Major League Baseball as a whole unit. But what Major League Baseball said, oh, no. We'll take Jackie Robinson, we'll take this, we'll take this, we're going to destroy your institution. Thank you. Yes? So basically what they said is that we will destroy your institutions to make our institutions better. And so, we had the example. So you were getting back to the Studio Museum and others said, well, why not enrich, if you're a black person, you've got $2 million, why not enrich our own institutions, which are self-defining, and I guess that's, when I'm in my field, you have all these young, fairly wealthy black people. I'm saying, well, with the money that you're making, and by the way, they're not going to be letting you make this money for too much longer. Seriously. Why don't you begin to build black institutions? So I thought that was really compelling when you were talking about, somebody, they didn't let them into the art institute in Chicago. Well, you know what? We'll do our own thing. But somehow that, again, I guess in your field that either hasn't happened. I mean, you've got the Studio Museum, but it could probably be, I don't know if that's realistic, but it's realistic. I mean, it's realistic for it seemingly to happen, if there's a consciousness.
Yeah, one of the things I think people have to understand, I mean, and I'll go back to something you said earlier about, just about the sort of status of black people in the United States. Well, the basic problem with black folks in the United States is we are undercapitalized as a population. Undercapitalized, because black people came in, they were capital. We were brought here as capital to do work, to not be paid for it, to generate capital for somebody else. That's what we were brought here for. And so, as a population after emancipation, the population was generally undercapitalized, which meant that they have less of an ability to compete, as any institution or any business would have to compete in a capitalist environment. And the United States didn't just become a capitalist country. It was a corporate entity when it started out. These were corporate investments that made those colonies. Those colonies were established so that they could make money. for the investors who invested in those colonies. That's how this whole enterprise got started. And in any kind of business environment, I mean, the competition for business is, can you continue to capitalize your business in such a way that you can fund research and development and growth and put yourself in a position where you can sustain your existence over a long period of time. And so how does it happen in all kinds of other entities? There are mergers and acquisitions. I mean, this is how business works. And if you can't compete in that business environment, then you're left on the margins always asking somebody to be generous enough to allow you to operate or to exist. And that position of having to always ask for permission to be present is a weak position to occupy. And what you want to do is you want to erase that position of weakness to the degree that you can. And that so I didn't just learn that the United States was a capitalist country. Once I finally came to a kind of comprehensive understanding that that's what it was, it changed my behavior about everything. This is the world in which you live. This is the environment in which you have to operate, and you have to make sure that what are we talking about now a lot is sustainability. And for business, we live on the south side of Chicago, and there are a lot of people who have this notion, yes, that it would be great for black businesses to operate in black neighborhoods. But black businesses don't survive because it's a good idea. They survive because they produce a product or they provide a service or they sell something that people want and that people will always want. And then when the market changes and people don't want that anymore, you can't keep opening your door selling that same stuff if people aren't buying it anymore. It just doesn't work like that. You got to change. You got to structure the way I think everything has to be thought of strategically. Life is strategic. Living is strategic. And you do the best you can to guarantee that you have the most longevity you can squeeze out of it. We're not all lucky enough to have it just naturally. I have a great aunt who is 104 years old, will be 105 in January. Her daughter just died, 3 months ago, Cheryl? Her sister had died at 90 years old almost 10 years ago. She said to me, I never thought I would be the one, they all lived together. They bought a house together so that all three of them would have it. She said, I never thought I would be the one who was left to dispose of or manage the house after everybody else was gone. She was supposed to be the one that went first. So you have no idea, but what you do have to do is, if you mean to have a certain kind of life, you have to take charge of it. If you mean to have a certain kind of career or existence in a field that you're operating in, you need to take charge of that. If you want to get to the top, you have to have some idea where the top is. And then you have to find a way to get there. And there's no guarantee that you will, but there's something about the activity of the process, of the practice, of trying to figure out how it can happen. There's something about that has a value that's independent of whether you actually succeed or not. It's just there's something about the process, and I love competition. I love it. I was telling Bill once. So you look at the art world. It's like there are those first string artists, and they're the ones who end up in the history book, like Marcel Duchamp. They're like Rauschenberg. They're like John Cage. They're like Jasper Johns. They're like those people. Those people will always be in the book. There is no circumstance in which those people will be excised from those history books. Not a circumstance you can't even begin to imagine or construct one. Jackson Pollock, William de Kooning, Mark Roscoe, they will always be. Their position is non-negotiable. And there's nobody who can construct an alternative history that will erase them from it either. You just can't. Because you got to deal with the work they did and the meaning of that work at the moment that it arrived on the scene. You got to deal with that. And so in terms of this pathway that 15-year-old would take, I mean, that's one of the things you have to always have uppermost in your mind. It's like, well, what was it about what they did that caused people to put them in the position they were in? What were the arguments for them and what were the arguments against them? Because there were arguments on both sides of that equation. And then you have to figure out from reading about what everybody has to say about it, well, where's the crack that I can pry open, put my thing in, and make my way up the path to the top? I mean, it seems as simple as that to me.
Well, let me ask you this. Jennifer, do we have that shot of Jackie Robinson and Jackson Pollock? Do we have it? Now, this is interesting. Now, two things. But first, I mean, before we get to this, it's kind of interesting. People are saying, okay, where are they going with this picture? You know? We'll get to it in a minute. But I was wondering I wrote a whole chapter in this book on Michael Jordan called The River Jordan. Somebody who reached a point of acclaim and decided to be politically neutral. That basically Republicans buy sneakers too. When you were in a position to lead, you didn't lead. And it raises a larger point of when black people get to a level of power, what do they do with the power? You know, too often they get to the level of power and they say, well, you know what, I don't want to rock the boat. You know, some women say that happens to women too sometimes. You get to this level of power and fight, but when you get there, you don't bring people up. You don't want to do. So one question is, what does your being at the Met? We talked a lot about just how tremendous this is. What does this mean globally to young black artists who see you get here, and they say there is a path. There is this path. You are the light, as they say. What does it mean for you being here, beyond the accolades and how just the tremendous amount of work and the more than 3 decades that you put doing it? But what does it mean in terms of the next 20 years, the next 30 years of the next of a next wave of young, talented black artists being here?
Well, I mean, I'm not alone in this. I mean, to the degree that I am able and available, I never miss an opportunity to tell people this is how you should be thinking about it. I mean, and that's literally that's all I can do on some, in the philosophical sense. So I can tell people this is what I did. This is how I thought about it. This is how I think you should think about it, because I think if you do a cost-benefit analysis, this approach will get you further than whatever you think you're trying to do. That's one way. There's also another way in the art world where you're only as I was going to say you're only as good as your integrity matters. Integrity matters. So if you say something about something, you better know what you're talking about, and you better not be bullshitting. Just don't, there's no time or no room or no place for that. Because it does nobody any good. And the thing is, if you can't, you were talking, when you were talking about Michael Jordan and you were talking about his success and the money he made and all that stuff, but there's a way in which you can confuse wealth with power. And wealth is not power. Power would have been the ability to walk away from the game and not be affected by the consequences of having done so. That's power. But for most athletes, the problem with most athletes, some of them are a knee injury away from ending their career next Sunday. And when they stop playing, they stop generating money. That's not power. So what does Michael Jordan do? He licenses his name to Nike. He licenses his name to some restaurants So whether Michael Jordan is at the restaurant or not, or whether he's got a pair of Nikes on, they will still, those Air Jordans will still be generating money whether Michael Jordan is there or not. And they will be generating money after Michael Jordan is dead, probably.
That's right.
So there are things, so power actually has, power is really the ability to operate in the world without fear of any consequences.
Right, right.
You know,
Right,
that's,
right.
so
I
that,
found,
but,
that's a great point, because what I found, and in the past few years, you've had a lot of young athletes, young black athletes, finally wake up and realize that, you really are part of the community. When you're in St. Louis and you're in, and you don't wear number 95 or number 22, you're likely to get a shot as anybody else if they don't, and I think more and more are really, because what happened is a lot of money weakened. Money is supposed to give you power. It's supposed to make you strong. But what has happened in my field is that it's made people weak because they don't want to lose it. They don't want to lose the money. So people who are really strong and tough and courageous in one arena are very weak and docile in another because they don't want to risk. They don't want to lose anything. And again, it gets back to what do you do with power?
Because that's also sort of not really understanding partly what money is, what money does, and how money is, well, I mean, it's the same thing, I guess, how money is made. I mean, how real money is made. Earning money is not making money. So you have now, there have been generations of now at this point, of black folks who had gotten a position on Wall Street, who've been working in investment banking, things like that. Now you have a lot more black organizations moving into private equity and things like that. And private equity is where that's making money. I mean, you create to create instruments that allow people to make money where they hadn't been able to make money before. That's power. And so if you go back to the whole the financial collapse, I mean, a credit default swap. Well, that was something somebody came up with as a strategy for generating money where you couldn't have generated money before. Now, it turns out to be a Ponzi scheme, like a lot of shell games. But as with shell games and Ponzi schemes in general, the sucker at the end is always left holding the bag, while the people who made all the money in the beginning, who invented the structure, they skipped off and are using their money now to do other things. So it's this notion that, if we think about what we really want, there was a speech that Louis Farrakhan made at San Diego, at UC San Diego in 1984, 1983, 84. A friend of mine who was teaching down there at the time got the recording. But there's a passage in that speech that gets to the point of the whole thing. And it comes down to how intelligently you engage with the world you live in. So he puts out this challenge, it's that business challenge, that even the Nation of Islam failed at itself, because there's no guarantee. But what you have to do is have fallback capital, ways of generating more capital so that you can keep trying new things. I mean, it's what the drug companies keep saying is the R&D they have to engage in order to get the drugs we need and sell them at the price that they need to sell them in order to make a profit. But Farrakhan, he says, for black folks, basically, it's like, if you're going to college, well, what are you going to college for? If you're going to get an education, don't you have an education? Does your education allow you to do things for yourself that everybody else's education allows them to do for themselves? I mean, isn't that the way you're supposed to be thinking about what you're doing? He says, can't you take the hide off of a cow and make a shoe like somebody else can take the hide off of a cow? Can't you take the bark off a tree and make toilet paper like somebody else can make toilet paper? Can't you do those things too? And if you can't do those things too, then where are you? He said, because his whole thing was that nobody respects a non-producer. And so in the general scheme of things, it's all about production. I mean, can you produce? And can you keep producing? And can you keep producing in a sustainable way so that it then finally has a chance to make an impact? And so if this retrospective is reflective of a 30-year slice of my career in production as an artist, I started out at the very beginning making sure I understood. I used to make ink, used to make chalk, used to make crayons, used to make all those things because I had to figure out some kind of way to make sure I could guarantee I could have materials if I couldn't afford to go to the art supply store and buy them. Because I didn't want there to be anything standing in my way, anything that would prevent me from being able to produce the things that I wanted to produce. If I had to make the materials myself, I was going to make them. I made paper, I did all that stuff because I didn't want to be without supplies. And that could happen sometimes at a crucial moment in your development. And there are a lot of people whose careers in sports were cut short by an injury, cut short by an indiscretion, you could say, or, something they didn't see coming. And where's that, at that point, where's their talent then? And where's the next opportunity? There are people who are pariahs who can't get picked up by any team now, not because they don't play well anymore, because of some other thing that happened in their development that they now have to bear the burden of. And so on some level, there are people we know, famous people, who can engage in some of those same indiscretions, and they carry on because it's almost like Donald Sterling. Now, Donald Sterling loses control of the LA Clippers, but Donald Sterling makes $4 billion in loss.
and the NBA gets rid of an asshole.
Right. But I don't think Donald Sterling is hurting so much because of that.
No. I mean, we were getting the wrap up. People are like, what we meant by this, and we're not going to really get a chance to get to it but the reason we are talking, this next section, I want to really get into evolution. I'm really obsessed with this parallel evolution of athletes, of black athletes, how they evolved in the sport. And we are talking, and you mentioned Jackson Pollock at 1948 breaking out, which is a sort of a magical year in baseball with Jackie Robinson. And you had these two iconoclastic people who had this tremendous impact on American culture in two different ways. The idea of black folks playing baseball, the idea of dripping, paint on a thing, because I was trying to get us to talk about this evolution. And you said something very interesting. You talked about Robinson and Pollock, and you agreed that Robinson was as iconoclastic in his way as Pollock was in his way. But then we had a conversation. We moved up to Muhammad Ali in 1962, who completely changed boxing, changed the way young black men were perceived. And I was asking you about, well, who was the black artist at that time who was changing, who made a similar radical change in the way art was made? And you said something interesting, which probably, but I've been thinking about it ever since. But you said, here's the problem with black artists. There are no black innovations in visual arts, no black American innovation. What's important about Bearden's work, because I mentioned, well, what about Bearden? He said, well, what's important about Bearden's work, what's important about Jacob Lawrence's work, is that he has a black subjectivity, that is a black perspective, a black narrative. That's what's important about the work, not the form. They didn't invent those forms. And I guess we went back and forth, but I thought that was really a compelling take in that, does that mean that black artists that there's a void? Because I thought that given our history in this country, the mere act of survival is an innovation. But technically, but
that's a different matter altogether.
That's a different conversation. okay. But I thought it's still a compelling point of view that they're really, in terms of the visual arts, there's not been and I said, well, what about you?
And what did I say?
You said that, you said that you thought that to some extent, perhaps, I mean, but people have painted black figures before, right? They've painted black, but, and I want you to elaborate, people have painted black figures. I want you to go through the whole thing. You said people have painted black figures before, but what? I mean, I just think that the idea that this void of black innovation in the visual arts is, I don't want to say phenomenal, but it almost didn't seem possible.
Well, the thing is, I mean, if you look at what I've done, I mean, as an artist, I mean, my work ends up being a synthesis of a variety of different approaches to the problems of representation. Everything that I'm doing is from things that I've observed elsewhere that were deployed to do different things. And what I've done was simply reorient those things so that their primary function was in the representation of a black subject, the black figure, and that the black figure becomes the primary subject of the picture. The primary subject matter in the picture, although the primary subject of the picture is how pictures are made. And when I look at the way pictures have been made across the historical spectrum, I feel like I've adapted enough of the things that I learned from that to make use of it in a way that advances my project by positioning the black figure in the pictures that I make in a way that I don't think they had been represented before. That's what I think I've done, and that I've also taken an idea. So I don't know, people who know Raymond Saunders as a painter and collage artist wrote in, well, I see some hands going up back there. But Raymond Saunders wrote an essay called Black is a Color. And so, and if you look at my paintings, black is a color. And I don't mean it's a color because it's black. It's a color in my paintings because I treat it like every other color that's in the picture. So if there's cobalt blue and ultramarine blue and phthalo blue and cerulean blue, that's 4 different blues. Well, in my painting, there's carbon black, there's iron oxide black, there's bone black, and then I make those even richer by adding other colors to those. So that I'm working with black chromatically, not as a limitation, which is the way almost everybody had thought about how black functioned in paintings up till this time, I think.
Bill and Kerry.
And so
Bill.
In my paintings, black is chromatic.
I think we have a hashtag. Hashtag black is chromatic. So please join me in thanking these 2 amazing people.
Oh.
I feel terrible.
Oh, we didn't get to that.
I feel like the Grim Reaper who arrived at, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but these folks, they actually have spent hours talking with each other. And so one of the things that I think we want to do is thank them again, and then we're going to join them for a reception in the Great Hall. But again, thank you, Bill, and thank you, Kerry, for your time.
All right.